is up, everyone? Today we're going to discuss on how to, in my opinion, the proper way of checking the valve clearance on your Honda motor. This is a Honda 390. This goes for any type of horizontal shaft, and what I mean by that is non-lawnmower styles. If you see that green one, the pressure washer out there, that is a vertical shaft. That one is very, very similar, but just a little bit different. Stay tuned to the end. I'll explain the differences and what you need to do and with those style. But in general, this is going to be pretty much universal, majority of it. First things first is we need to locate the valves. The valves always have a cover on a Honda. They're not, unless you have a very, very old Honda. You don't have a flathead, you have an overhead valve. So you need to find the valve cover and take it off. That could be troublesome sometimes, and let me explain why. That valve cover, depending on the type you have, sometimes you have 4 bolts, sometimes you only have 1. That part's not the problem though. Those are just 10 millimeters almost every single time. The problem is how is the valve cover sealed. This one, a majority of the horizontal shafts have a gasket. If you're careful enough, you can save that gasket and reuse it later. If you have the vertical, like that Honda over there, you have a silicone style of seal. That is kind of annoying because you're not really going to be able to reuse that. In a pinch, you potentially could put it back on there and might leak a little bit, but for long-term use, you do never want to do that. You want to clean it up, so don't do that. Now, you're thinking to yourself, well, how do I clean it up? I personally just take like a little scraping tool, clean off the cover. The cover is a little bit more forgiving. The surface on the machine, however, on the head, is a machined flat surface. You have to be very careful. You don't want to scrape that up too bad or at all. So be careful of that. And then you go to your local auto parts store. You're going to pick up 2 things. Black RTV, or you could go on there and buy Honda Bond. It's basically exactly the same thing. Or basically anything that's going to be okay to be exposed with oil. That's the main thing. It doesn't really get all that hot in there, so you don't really necessarily need high heat. But if you can find one that's high heat and oil resistance, well, you know, it's your money. Next, go down the other aisle and get something called feeler gauges. They're just small pieces of metal, different thicknesses on each side. It will tell you what thickness they are, but that's only half the battle. We have to know what thickness we need. Go to Google, type in your model of Honda. If you don't know what model of Honda you have because of lack of documentation where it usually is or anywhere else it could be, every Honda somewhere on the side will tell you. This one is beneath that, so you can't really see it, but it will tell you the displacement and also the model number. It will always at least tell you the displacement. The displacement's almost always the same model number. So if you see you have 159 cc's of displacement, you have GX 160 or whatever. Point being, figure out what it is. Next, you have to go to Google, type in model number, valve clearance, and in there it will give you a guide. It's going to give you 2 numbers and it's going to give you a range. For this one, for instance, it's 6 thousandths of an inch on the intake side and 8 thousandths of an inch on the exhaust side. It's going to give you plus or minus a certain amount. Usually it's 2 thousandths of an inch or even 1 thousandth of an inch depending on the clearance. Now, what does that mean? That means you take your feeler gauge, and I'm going to find 6 thousandths of an inch because I'm going to do the intake first. Now, you take your feeler gauge, it's very thin, I mean it's literally thousandths of an inch, 6 of them, and you're going to disconnect your spark plug. You can also remove your spark plug, but that's not necessary. You at least do want to remove your spark plug. Put the boot somewhere. You're going to spin the motor around. And what you want to see is you want to see the valve closest to the carburetor, or if you see like a little channel going to that valve from the carburetor, that's your intake. Now you want to spin until the opposite valve, which is the exhaust. I'm on the compression stroke, and I have spark plugs in there, so I just don't want to pull on it too much and mess this up. There we go. It's at the bottom, or close to the bottom of its travel. Now, why are we waiting for the valve to be at the bottom of its travel? The reason is this. If you look online, it's going to tell you to do something called top dead center. What is top dead center? It's also abbreviated TDC. It is the furthermost up. It's when the piston's traveling up through the cylinder, it's at its highest point on the compression stroke. Theoretically, at that point in time, both valves should be sealed completely, because it's going to be combusting, and if there's any type of open of the valve, then it's not going to have enough compression to combust properly, and it's not going to run properly. So technically, they always say to do on the compression stroke. My problem was this: unless you do this all the time, or if you're just watching YouTube videos and you've never done that before, how do you know you're on top of the compression stroke? What you could do is you could shove like a screwdriver or something down there. That's not usually a good idea to shove anything down the cylinder. So one surefire way of knowing that at least one valve is completely closed is when one is open, the other one can't be open. So you check the one that's not being compressed. And by doing that, you just shove this in between the rocker, this is the rocker, and the valve stem. Now, see how it moves a little bit? You want it to move a little bit. You don't want it to be so tight you can't even fit your feeler gauge in there. But you don't want it so loose where if you were to let go of it, it's going to instantly fall. You want to have a little bit of tension on there. That's why you have a plus or minus, because you can have a little bit too loose, and it's fine. So, I know for a fact that this motor is no issue. So we're going to assume you've done this. Now on a Honda, let's say you find out that this is too tight or too loose. It doesn't really matter. This smaller 10 millimeter on the outside is a retaining nut. Basically what that means is it holds pressure against the actual adjustment on the bottom, and what that does is it keeps it in place. So to fix it, you take a 10 millimeter and a 14 millimeter, you loosen this, and what you end up having to do, depending on what you need, you move the bigger one on the bottom in and out until your feeler gauge, when you are putting it through the space between the rocker and the valve stem, is tight enough where it still has a little bit of tension. And in this case, it's a little helpful tip for you to have go one size up, because usually when you tighten this, it will kind of make it a little too tight, and if you're already one size up, you can then tighten it. It's going to be too tight for, let's say in my case, I do 6 thousandths. I go up to 7. It's going to be too tight for 7, but if I put the 6 back, it will be perfect for the 6. It's going to save you a lot of time. You don't have to keep on going back and forth, because it could get quite frustrating. Now, let's say you have to do this for both of them, which is a good idea. You should always check for both, but you know, you don't always have to work on both. Just because you're working on one doesn't mean you have to work on both. You should always check both, but that's it. Good habit to get into is spinning the motor over 1 or 2 times at least. Well, I mean 1 or 2 times. I don't mean just one rotation of this piston. I mean 1 full cycle. That means 2 rotations of the piston. So I usually like doing it 2, just to make sure. What that will end up doing is maybe this was off a little bit, and by moving it around, kind of put it back in its correct location or correct placement, and it might have adjusted it. So check it one last time, both of them, and then as long as nothing's changed, you're good to go. If you do have a silicone style valve cover, While you're doing this, it is a good idea. Almost every single one I've ever seen tells you to cover your ears. Well, it doesn't tell you that, but you should do this now. Almost every one of them says you should probably have some type of skin. So you put it on the valve cover, let it skin over a little bit, and then you can install it. Each one is a little bit different, and just note that the spring and winter time, when it's colder, or even fall, can make those times a little bit different. So be aware of that. You don't want to cause a problem. So if you have one like mine, you just have to make sure it's tight, like I'm doing right now. And boom, it's on there. You don't have to worry as long as your gasket's not broken or in poor condition. Mine looked fine and it was in good condition, it wasn't broken. I'm okay with keeping it myself. You can always replace it if you feel it's necessary, but it generally, in my opinion, isn't, unless, like I said, it is in poor condition or it's broken. So let's go ahead and conclude the video with why. I'm going to give you 3 scenarios of why you should check your valves and what poor valve clearancing can cause. Number 1 reason for checking your valves is duration of time. Every overhead valve motor is going to have a maintenance schedule, and that maintenance schedule usually has some type of hourly mark of your valves needing to be checked. Common. So you need to check that routinely. Now, that's the first reason. Second reason is it's not starting because it has little to no compression. Now, what that is caused by are the valves being too tight. You know that the feeler gauge we're using, if you can't get a single one in there, then assuming you don't have internal damage, of course, the valve is just too tight. You adjust it to the correct clearance, and then you pull it over. You should feel compression again. Basically what it's doing is not allowing the valve to close to correctly or at all. A little bit of compression seeking out. How you can tell that is if it's in the beginning stages, maybe it's not sealing a little bit. You'll get popping through the exhaust or the intake, depending on which valve is too tight. And that's a pretty good sign that you have a valve issue. Or if it's really bad, you might just have no compression at all. You could do a leak out test and see which one it is. Leak down test is when you put compressed air into the cylinder, and then you hear where the air is coming out of. Depending on where the air is coming out of is your problem. That's expensive for the tool, and it's a lot easier just to check your valves. Unless you have a Honda like my pressure washer over there, then maybe it might be worth it if you don't feel like having to regoop your valve cover. Next one's going to be too loose, and that one, it's going to be 2 reasons why you're going to notice it, and one is going to be a little bit more important in my opinion than the other. One is going to be real clacky. What I mean clacky is you kind of just hear like noises going all the time, like it's metal on metal, and that is not good. Somewhat, but it's not horrible. But more importantly, if your exhaust is completely out of spec, without getting too detailed, to make it easier to start, your exhaust will have something called a compression release added to it, and will let out a little bit of compression when you're starting. When the motor's running, there's a little mechanism inside there that deactivates, and then that no longer happens. But in the meantime, slower rotations, or even a starter in that slower rotation, that mechanism is not going to be able to work properly, because what it needs is it needs the correct clearance in order for it to release that compression, that correct amount of compression. If it's too open, it won't have that, and you'll be pulling on full compression. What that can result in is a very hard motor to start, or even the motor kicking back at you. What I mean by that is it literally pulls the handle out of your hand, and if you're not expecting it, you could hurt yourself. Don't do that. So too tight is bad. Too loose, also bad. Long duration of time without being adjusted, not as bad, but could be bad. So those are going to be the three main reasons why you need to adjust valves on a Honda. The only real difference between this Honda and my pressure washer style Honda over there is, besides the valve cover, of course, is the rockers are going to be a little bit different. You could have something called an overhead cam. And an overhead cam is you actually see the cam being driven by a belt from the crankshaft, but the cam is right underneath the valve. And then the little cam lobe, you'll actually see it moving and engaging. So that one, you could potentially go to top dead center, because you literally will see the valve, you will literally see the lobe in the cam not touching anything. And if that's the case, go right ahead, go to top dead center. It's fine. It's super easy. You'll see two rocker arms. They'll be a little bit different than that. They actually will have a little bit of an arm on the bottom of it. And then in the middle, you'll see it's like a circle with like a little triangle on top of it. So it's like a, you know when you go to Google Maps and you see that little pin? It's like a pin except upside down. That point, or the lobe, needs to be facing directly out, facing you 100% straight. If it is, you know you're a top dead center. There's also markings on the bottom. If you want to look up on how to set a timing on that style of engine, I have a video on that, so check that out. But I'm not going to get into that. Just know that's a quick and dirty way. Or you can just do the same way we just did and make sure one valve is compressed. That's a safer way in my opinion, but I'll let you make that decision. Other than that, you have now set the valve clearance on your Honda engine. They're all more or less the same principle, same tools are needed, maybe just a little additional silicone is needed and a gasket. That's it. So I hope you've learned something. If you did, leave a thumbs up. That helps me out a lot. If you like what you see, definitely subscribe. Follow me on Instagram at SmallEngine101. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. If you like what you see, leave a comment below. Tell me what motor this video helped you on, and I'll be happy to, read the comment. And other than that, I'll see you in my next video. Have a good night.